Yeah, today, like I said, we're going to, of course, talk about like today and Wednesday. We'll get into discussing the topic of World War One. Now, of course, a very interesting topic, of course, which they think World War One pretty much set the tone for the rest of the 20th century. Of course, later that you have. So I'll kind of get into like the background of it. I'll kind of go back to the 19th century, talk about some events that kind of led to World War One later. I'll talk about causes of it, which was like 4 or 5 main causes I think that caused World War One. And we'll get to like the beginning of the war too, as well. We should have time to get into that as well overall. So if you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture and the live stream, please let me know. You can also subscribe to my channel as well. So anyway, kind of get into the, of course, subject of World War One. World War One, by the way, lasted roughly a little over 4 years. Of course, you study about World War One in general. Starts in 1914, and then, of course, eventually World War One you can see lasts till 1918. I think November 11th, 1918 is the, of course, end date, of course, of World War One. But I'll kind of get into today discussing, a lot of the causes that really led to World War One in general. Of course, those are all the things they always talk about with World War One. The isms of, the 19th century. They sometimes people joke about it. Nationalism, imperialism, militarism. I think those are the big things that really, of course, led to it. We'll get into also the various alliance systems, which there were these two composing alliance systems that were kind of against each other that are there, Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. So I'll get to that. And then we'll get to the big thing later, of course, that really leads to World War One, which, behind me, the Archduke getting shot, by Gavrilo Princip. That's pretty much the thing that really, leads into, of course, World War One. So now World War One does, have a nickname. They often call it, by the way, they call it the Great War. That was the often nickname of the war. And some people joke that it was the so-called war to end all wars and that there wouldn't be any other wars, after that, because basically World War One was considered one of the bloodiest wars, of course, in modern times. The war would, I think, claim at least 9 million soldiers' deaths in the war. And I think the total casualties were like 14, 15 million combined, just to kind of give you an idea. I think you had to go all the way back to, I want to say, 30 Years' War to have a war that was even maybe just as bloody than that and the Napoleonic Wars. I think both those are pretty bloody conflicts overall. Now, a lot of the causes of the war stem from a combination of like long-term causes, which I'll get to today. And of course, we'll talk about the short-term one, which was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Really, a lot of the causes went back to all these so-called rivalries between the so-called, they call them the great powers of Europe. I think it's a common term they used between the 19th and 20th centuries. France, Britain, those are the big ones, of course, up there with Russia. But you got new players coming in the late 19th century, like Germany and Italy unifying. Also Austria-Hungary, it's been around as well. And also the Ottoman Empire, which was actually weakening at the time. Now, they were all talking about the Turks kind of becoming the sick old man of Europe and declining. So those all those are kind of different causes of why World War One will eventually decline. Of course, we'll get to the later the thing behind that. But Brittany's also joining us, I think, in StreamYard as well. Looks like it. Seeing right there. So hope you're having a good morning. Brittany. Now, let's talk about, of course, some of the different causes that were big. I'll kind of get into one major cause they talk about the most, which usually World War One, the big cause of it, of course, is nationalism. They always talk about that issue. That's clear like the number one thing I think that really led to World War One later. And so you have this idea of modern states forming, of course, in Europe. And there was even ideas to create states for people that didn't have states, like Polish people and Slavs and other types of peoples. Even Jews and Arabs, I think, start talking about, Arab Jewish nationalism and things like that as a whole. And so they have this idea, where uh, I've got a list of different states that kind of became unified, or there was an idea to have like these unified states in Europe. Besides the Poles, which I mentioned, Slavs, later would want to have their own states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Greeks actually get their independence from the Ottoman Empire, the Greek War for Independence, which was a war in the early 19th century where Greece broke away in 1832. Belgium also created their own state, 1831. Hungarians had an idea to create their own state too, as well. So there's all kinds of groups, like the Serbs. Look at the Serbians, other peoples that want their own separate countries throughout Europe as well. Now, I'll talk about one issue that they usually talk about that's kind of very famous, which is the Italian unification movement, which started like right after the period of the Napoleonic Wars and in the so-called Age of Metternich that followed. Unification of Italy, that was something that the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia was behind. They would eventually go on to form what we call the Kingdom of Italy by the 1860s. The idea was to kind of, unify all of the Italian mainland, Sicily, even Sardinia, of course, added into that as well. The actual movement, Italian unification movement anyway, was known as the Risorgimento, which was an Italian word that meant resurgence. And it's popularized by different people. I know that the main things that popularized it was two people I can kind of give you. One was Napoleon himself, had actually created a Kingdom of Italy when he created the first French Empire. But after what happened was after the Congress of Vienna met, in 1814, 1815, they got rid of that. But the idea of a unified Italy was still, on the back burner, of course. Also, Italian nationalists, Giuseppe Mazzini, was also kind of seen as kind of like the heart behind the whole idea of unification. But they prevented him from kind of getting anywhere with that because of Metternich and his conservative status quo that reigned over Europe during that time. But yeah, those are the three founding fathers, they say, of modern Italy that would be created later, which is Mazzini. You also have Count Camillo Cavour, who was the prime minister of Piedmont Sardinia. He was another one, of course, behind it as well. And then he was considered like the so-called brain behind it. They always talk about, I think, Cavour. So Mazzini was the heart, Cavour was the brain. And also Giuseppe Garibaldi, you see on the far right there in that picture, famous Italian general, helped to unify Italy as well, especially the southern part of it. He was considered like the sword that helped to kind of unify it. Garibaldi was very famous for his expedition, 1860-61, where he led a force of I think it was actually 1,200 men. I thought it was 1,200 men actually, but whatever. They often call him the so-called Red One because he would wear these reddish uniforms in battle. And they called his forces the so-called Red Shirts. And they actually conquered southern Italy, which was actually ruled by the state called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies at the time. And he was able to take over Naples and Sicily, and then they later added that into what would be later the Kingdom of Italy. And then Piedmont Sardinia was able to unify the northern part of Italy with that. And so in 1861, Italy formed a kingdom, which it would be up to like around World War II overall. Of course, since then, you see a republic now. But the first king of Italy was actually Victor Emmanuel II. He was one of the last kings of Piedmont Sardinia, northern Italy. And so he reigned as the first king from 1861 to 1878. And it's under his reign that Italy actually adopts Rome as its capital again, which hadn't really been a capital, since going back, I guess, to the Romans and all that. So yeah, the unification of Italy, that was something that really kind of was one thing that kind of changed, I think, Europe later. But they think Count Cavour, the prime minister of Piedmont, sorry, and he's also the first prime minister of Kingdom of Italy as well later, was like the mastermind behind unifying all those different Italian states that were there. There's Garibaldi. Garibaldi was very famous later for fighting in like South America. He fought like all over the world, and he was considered, some kind of military genius. And I think there was even a case where Abraham Lincoln tried to hire him as a general to fight against the Confederates, but he backed down from that. Then the other thing that happened that's also famous too, of course, that they think helped cause World War I later was the unification of Germany. That happened eventually in 1871 under Chancellor von Bismarck, who, you know about, it's now called the so-called Iron Chancellor. He helped to take Prussia and a bunch of other German states and merge them into what would be later the German Empire, as it's called now. They think that's important because they think that that actually helped to offset the balance of power in Europe, which they think led to World War I. Because remember, the Congress of Vienna had been created to kind of create a balance of power in Europe. And they think that Germany kind of offset that, of course, afterwards. So that's something that's kind of important with that. There's, of course, Bismarck right there. Anyway, it was caused by different things. If you look into like different conflicts that happened back in the 19th century, there was one event that's very important called the Austro-Prussian War, which they also call it the so-called 7 Weeks War, which lasted, I think, around July of 1866 is when it happened. And in that war, Prussia defeated Austria in a very short war, like just a few weeks. It lasted. And it allowed the Prussians and the German states to kind of unify as what later became known as the North German Confederation. And this particular state was kind of like a predecessor to the German Empire that would form later. If you look at this kind of a map showing it, you can see that what happened after that war was that basically the Germans were able to kind of consolidate the northern part of now what is Germany today. They can form this one state, and they, of course, they kicked the Austrians out. And so the whole German Confederation, which had been created by basically the Congress of Vienna, was gone. It didn't exist anymore. And so later, the German state that's going to form is going to be a German state without Austria, is what it'll be in the future. So that was kind of an important conflict, that one. The other thing that happened too, as a result of that war, that some people always talk about as well, they also have this deal where the Austro-Hungarian Empire formed because of it. The Hungarians had been wanting their own rights and power. And so basically they created this state, which was, I guess, the Austrian Empire, became eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or also called Austria-Hungary. And this became like this multinational state that would last until 1918, but only the Austrians and the Hungarians had any real power. If you know about this particular state, it's basically was a state that was comprised of many kinds of nationalities that you can see right here. Germans and Hungarians were the main ones, which Austrians were basically Germans. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians. There's all kinds of different peoples that were within. I think Jews and other groups, of course, were also there. And so Austria-Hungary was a mess. It was just made up of all these different peoples, and it's part of why the empire broke up. That and they lost World War I. So that's going to be something that's going to be real important. Geographically, it's a pretty large state. It's, I think, the only state bigger than that in Europe is Russia, at the time. The other conflict they think that is very important that led to also why Germany was able to unify was the Franco-Prussian War. That happened, a very short war, about 6 months, 1870 to 71. Otto von Bismarck was involved in that. He helped to instigate that war with the French Empire under Napoleon III. It's going to allow, like I said, the Germans to unify all their territories together. And the war is interesting about the war, how it kind of started, which is kind of weird. I think the war started because of a diplomatic spat over the fact that there was a candidate to the Spanish throne at the time that was a Hohenzollern. I think his name was Prince Leopold. And the Prussians were thinking about putting him on the throne. However, the French were furious about this because they wanted a Bourbon on the throne instead. And so there was a telegram sent, I think, by Bismarck, which I think was sent to, I think it was kind of going back and forth between him and the king of Prussia at the time, King Wilhelm. It was called the Eames telegram. And I think in the telegram, Bismarck made it look like he was insulting the French and all that. And so the French got mad and declared war on the Prussians. And so what ended up happening, if you know this map here, the German forces invaded France, and they didn't really have a chance. The German forces were just superior to the French, not just because of the Industrial Revolution, but I think after the Napoleonic Wars, the Germans had revamped their military and all that. They also had a lot of great generals as well. And anyway, what happened, the big thing was the Battle of Sedan. I think that was the pivotal battle of the Franco-Prussian War. After the German forces invaded into eastern France, the French forces were led by Napoleon III near the Belgian border. They were actually encircled in early September 1870. And what ended up happening, if you know about this, was that Napoleon III was actually captured after they were forced to surrender most of their forces. There's a very famous painting made of Bismarck and Napoleon III sitting together after Napoleon III was captured and all that. And what happened was, like I said, it caused the collapse of the Second French Empire. And right after that, the French declared another republic, so-called Third Republic of France. And so, yeah, the whole reign of Napoleon III is kind of a farce at the end, the way he kind of went out at that point. Then from there, the German forces then besieged Paris, which lasted several months until January of 1871, when they were forced to eventually capitulate in defeat. The French had to actually pay war reparations back to the Germans after they lost the war, which is kind of humiliating about that as well. Now, one of the big things that came out, if you know about this, out of the whole Franco-Prussian War, is that the German Empire formed. If you know about this, the Germans actually met at Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors on January 18, 1871. And so from there, they then created the so-called, second, they call it the Second Reich. That's the common term, of course, they use for it, for the German Empire. The First Reich was like the Holy Roman Empire, like a long time ago. So you get this deal where the actual king of Prussia, which is Wilhelm, becomes known as the Kaiser Wilhelm, as they call it, which Kaiser is kind of like a Caesar or an emperor. So you got the French having their republic at the same time as the Germans have their empire forming, basically. And so they weren't really able to stop Germany from really unifying all of its territories together, which is definitely seen as as a major catalyst to causing World War I, of course, later. We've already talked about it too. Russia's decline too in the East kind of prevented that. So Russia didn't come to the aid of the French or anything like that. They had been enemies before, going back to the Crimean War and all that. But that was something that maybe could have prevented it, but obviously didn't. So now another cause too of the war I wanted to get into. Here's, by the way, let me show you real quick here, kind of like another picture too, showing you like what Europe looks like after World War I. So you can see how Germany in the middle here is unified. So you can see right here as one state, as an empire. So you got the Republic of France over here, Austria-Hungary over here, and then the Russian Empire, of course, over here. So This is all kind of what Europe looks like, before on the eve of, I guess, World War One. We have later. Another topic which they think caused World War One was imperialism. They call it new imperialism. I think is often a term they use as well. That's where a lot of the European states began to create colonization throughout the world. Africa being one main area, of course, that was important. Also in the Asia and the Pacific, especially China, Southeast Asia, Burma, India. Those are all areas that the Europeans kind of went into. It was kind of seen as an extension of the Industrial Revolution and all that. And of course, one of the most famous, aspects of it was the so-called, scramble for Africa, where the European powers began to build colonies all throughout Europe, European colonies in Africa, and yeah, you can see the French were in, West Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, uh, French West Africa. You got the Belgium and the Congo under Leopold II, and of course down here, Portuguese, believe it or not, Angola, Mozambique. Germans were in German East Africa, where Tanzania is today. Nambia, of course, in Southwest Africa, also as well. Of course, the Dutch and the English were all down here. Rhodesia, South Africa, as well. British up in Egypt, Sudan, Kenya. So you can see all these areas that are there. And even the Italians, believe it or not, start getting in later into Africa. Libya, also down into like Ethiopia, Somalia area as well. So all those different areas were things that are important. And why did it all, of course, occur? They think it was because it was an extension of the industrialization. The fact that the colonies wanted to, like all these Europeans wanted to create these colonies because the fact that they needed cheap labor, especially natural resources, I think was one of the main things that they really wanted. Also further markets to sell their goods, and all that. And some of the powers like Britain and others kind of saw it as a way to civilize people. They thought they needed civilizing, which I think in Britain they sometimes called it white man's burden, from a poem by Kipling, all that. And so that's something that was kind of seen as kind of a racist view of it as well. But you even have the United States. People forget about that, but the United States was even involved, in colonization as well. We were in the Caribbean, Pacific Ocean, like Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines. Japan got involved too, like Korea, later, of course, into Manchuria, and also into the Pacific as well. So Japan was also in China, and a lot of the European powers and United States and others were instrumental in really controlling even China, like the Boxer Rebellion and all those things you've probably heard about, stories that where basically colonialism kind of takes over parts of Asia. Now, the other big thing that they talk about too that led to World War One was militarism. That's kind of seen as kind of a thing that really led to World War One as well. Yeah, it's because they had this arms race that they had before the war, where the European powers started stockpiling new kinds of weapons, building up their armies. They think that led to why World War One was very bloody as well, because of the Industrial Revolution and all that. And so the Industrial Revolution helped develop new kinds of weapons. I've got a list of them here, but new kinds of airplanes coming out that could be used in the war, tanks, machine guns, new kinds of artillery, submarines, flamethrowers, poison gas, battleships, all kinds of things that obviously made the war a lot bloody that we can think of. And you can see here that it made more of a global war, of course, because of it. Like Britain had these dreadnought battleships, like you see on the bottom there, that they built, and so the Germans wanted to kind of counter them with building kind of similar kinds of naval fleets and all that. So that helped to kind of create this rivalry throughout the world that eventually led to World War One later. Then, of course, the other big thing that happened, of course, that led to the war, was the rival alliance systems. They think it caused a chain reaction war. You saw that little video how they started, declaring war on each other and all that. And so that has a lot to do with why, the war happened for sure. And talk about the two alliances. Triple Alliance was founded in 1882, and the Triple Entente in 1907. And the Triple Alliance, which was later called the Central Powers in World War I, included originally Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. You can see there. Anyway, the only thing was Italy dropped out of the war later. You know about that when World War I broke out. They stayed neutral at first. They would switch to the Allied side. And so Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, that would be the states later that would be, of course, in the so-called Central Powers, as they called it. So you had that side in the war. And then the other side was the Triple Entente, which included originally Britain, France, and Russia together. And later it was called the Allied Powers or Allies in World War I, which those are a bunch of other countries that joined it later. Serbia was in it, Romania, Italy joined later. I want to say in 1915, United States, 1917, and also Japan even joined it as well in World War I. So that all kind of helped to create World War I later. Here's kind of a better picture, of course, the alliances you can see there, but you can see all the areas that kind of in that tannish color would be the areas that would be the so-called Central Powers. And then you can see all the powers that were in the Allied side as well. So yeah, Britain, France, Russia, those are the ones at the beginning that would be in it, and then Italy would join. You can see some minor ones that were in it. Romania, Serbia, Greece were in it, Portugal, then later the United States as well. Now, of course, the big thing that really caused World War I, as you know, was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. If anything, that's the main thing they think that helped to spark the war in the end. Which you can see happened on June 28th, 1914. We already know, of course, happened in Sarajevo, right? Bosnia, where it happened. Now, they call it Bosnia-Herzegovina is the common name they call it as well. Now, a little bit about Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. His actual uncle was Franz Joseph. He was the emperor, and I think his own son had killed himself, and so he was going to give the throne to his nephew, who was the Archduke at the time. And he was kind of controversial because he had married this woman named Sophie Chodik, who I think I've got a picture of. You want to see her. He's down here on the left there. That's, of course, his wife touring Sarajevo on that date of June 28th. She was actually from a common background, common, like lower class. They call it a morganetic marriage, I think is what they dubbed it back in those days. And so I was kind of controversial about it. But anyway, the reason why he went to Sarajevo, he was making this official state visit. They think that the Austro-Hungarian side was thinking of invading Serbia because the fact that Serbia had a lot of these pro-Slavic nationalists that wanted to unify the area, what we call Yugoslavia today. And they think the assassination itself was planned by this terrorist organization that was known as the Black Hand, you see there. And the Black Hand was a Serbian secret military organization. It was a kind of a pan-Slavism or Slavic nationalist movement that wanted to use terror tactics, basically, to form statehood for Slavs in that area. They wanted to call it Yugoslavia, I think was the common name later, which would be a real country that would form after World War I. And they were kind of angry because Bosnia was part of Austria-Hungary. They wanted it, of course, to be part of like a separate state with them. And if you know much about that area of the so-called Balkans, which is where it happened, the assassination, it was considered a powder keg of Europe at the time. It's that area down there. which includes all these countries like Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, and Bosnia was kind of in there too as well. And you have all these countries around it, like Russia nearby, Austria-Hungary that's nearby, the Ottoman Empire as well. And so Serbia wants Bosnia to be part of them as part of a separate state, a Slavic state, basically. And so they think that's why pretty much they killed him, thinking that if they did that, that would happen. And so they had this man named Dragutin Dimitrievich who was in that organization. He was in the Serbian military. He actually planned the actual assassination. That picture right there of that man you're looking at. Apis was a nickname, which I think meant the bull. Anyway, he hired 7 assassins to basically cross the border from Serbia into what is Bosnia. They are armed with bombs and pistols. They were all like teenagers, pretty much, that they actually, I guess, enlisted to do this. And the weird thing about the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it actually was, there were actually 2 attempts on his life. That's the weird thing about it. There was one where they mentioned already, I think the one in the video, they had talked about how this man named the Jelko Kabranovich threw a bomb at the motorcade as it went through the city of Sarajevo. He was a member of this Slavic nationalist group called Young Bosnia, which Gavrilo Princip was in as well. Young Bosnia wanted to basically form a Yugoslavian state and join with the Serbians and all that. And the bombing attempt failed. I think it injured a few people, but he was arrested with, I think, some others that were nearby that were involved in it. And so I guess nobody thought there would be another attempt, after that would occur. Here, of course, is the actual famous car that, of course, they toured Sarajevo in, which was a 1911 Grafton Stift double Phaeton, which was a convertible. They often call it the so-called death car, if you know about this. Kind of like John F. Kennedy. It's kind of like the John F. Kennedy assassination in a sense. John F. Kennedy going around Dallas in a convertible, kind of like that. And apparently what happened was he was kind of angry about the whole thing, the Archduke, and so he wanted to go visit the hospital and visit the injured people that had been hurt by the bomb and all that. And so that's why the second attempt happened, of course, where Gavrilo Princip was able to, of course, shoot the Archduke. And so basically, as they talked about in the video, the driver went down the wrong, street, basically. And so as they were backing up, he was able to come up to him and basically shoot him. 2 shots in the car. And so they think what happened was that they believe that he shot her first. I think she tried to shield the Archduke from him. He shot her in the stomach, and then, of course, the Archduke got shot in the neck. They died, I think, within an hour right afterwards. And so Princip was immediately arrested afterwards. That, of course, is a very famous photograph of Princip right there in the picture. He's the one that's kind of being carried away right here. Supposedly they took the broadside of their swords, they were beating him with it in the head afterwards. And it, of course, angered a lot of people, the assassination. I don't think he was trying to kill her or the Archduchess. I think that was an accident. He was trying to shoot, I think, the Archduke, as far as they know. What eventually happens, this whole thing upsets Austria-Hungary. They're angered about this, the fact that the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne has been killed. And so eventually they sent an ultimatum to the Serbians saying, you need to arrest all these people, that the ringleaders are behind it, like Dragutin Dimitrievich and all that. And they actually agreed to most of the terms, but apparently Austria-Hungary didn't want to hear any about that. And so I think the main goal was really invasion at that point. And so what happened was on July 28th, which is a Tuesday, you can see, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And so they really think that that's the beginning of, World War I at that point. But at that point, it's like a small little conflict between Austria, Hungary and the Serbs. But when they do this, one of the things that happens, the Russians kind of, start to come in too, and they get pretty angry about that. And that's going to lead to eventually what's going to, of course, occur because of it. You're going to get this whole deal where Germany and Russia, they start to mobilize their forces as well in the war because of the different alliances that are there. That's going to lead into, World War One expanding and becoming a bigger war. Russia was concerned that, the Serbians, they're Orthodox, they have Slavic backgrounds, they want to help defend their brothers there. And so that's no reason. And Germany wants to back Austria-Hungary because they're in the same triple alliance as well. And so that's another reason too, of course, why that happens. Now, one thing that's very famous about right before the war, there's an incident that they refer to diplomatically as the so-called July crisis. It's often dubbed. It was a kind of a series of interrelated diplomatic escalations into the war that happened over like a period of like 3 or 4 days. I think mostly July 28th to July 31st. It kind of happens like going into the weekend, which was kind of a bad thing at that point. And as that's all going on, the Germans are starting to get antsy because the Russians, are starting to mobilize their forces. They're really concerned that Emperor Nicholas II is going to launch an attack on Germany at any time on their eastern border and all that. And so the Germans decide that they got to go to war and declare war, on the rest of Europe. And I'll kind of explain why, the Germans wanted to go to war in 1914, even though the whole conflict was really about Austria-Hungary and Serbia at the time. Well, the Germans were very concerned that they would get attacked from two different sides. I don't know if you heard about the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was this military plan that had been developed back in 1905. And the reason why they developed this was they were worried that they'd have to fight a two-front war against the Triple Entente, especially against Russia and France. And so the Germans decided to implement this plan to basically try to offset that. And what they realized was that the French had a better military than the Russians did. And so what they'd want to do was they'd want to attack into northern France, because northern France, that was where France had all its industries and all that. And then after they defeat the French in a short war, they could then turn their forces using, like, say, railroads, and then attack the Russians in the east and finish them off. So you can see here, it was based on speed, the amount of speed that they could, launch this invasion into France. They were hoping that the Russians wouldn't be able to mobilize in several weeks, maybe 6 weeks at least, to maybe attack Germany. But I think what happened was the Russians were able to mobilize faster, and so they had to take forces away to fight the Russians in the east, and they didn't have enough force to attack the west, which is later kind of something that happens I'll talk about when they go into northern France. But so what ends up happening, because the Schlieffen Plan, the Germans declare war on the French and the Russians, of course, and also Belgium, because they're going to have to invade Belgium as well. And so in a matter of days, by the first week of August, we're basically at war, in World War I. So that's basically how the war kind of, tipped the balance, because of the so-called Schlieffen Plan that eventually happens. So Germany declares war on Russia and France, and then the next thing you know, the Russians and the French, declare war on the Germans. The British come into the war. I think there was kind of a debate about whether Britain ought to support the French or not, but they were kind of in this alliance with them, with the Russians, the Triple Entente they had. Now, I think the British were kind of concerned that they were worried about the Germans affecting their empire, throughout the world. They might attack it. So basically, that's what led to eventually the war going for them as well. And I think the British were kind of concerned with Germany going through Belgium as well, which is kind of like a neutral power. Here's kind of a map showing you how the Germans invaded into France. So they invaded from 2 points through Belgium and Luxembourg, and then also from their western border, close to the Rhineland area. And At first, what happened was the Belgium didn't last long. I think they lasted, I want to say, 3 weeks. They fell pretty much to the German forces. They get actually occupied during the war. Like the whole war, pretty much Belgium is occupied by the Germans for over 4 years. And so the British start sending in forces at that point. The so-called British Expeditionary Force comes over from England to help the French in the war. And at that point, the Germans start their drive on what is Paris, and it leads to a famous battle that's later called the Battle of the Marne, which happens, I think, around the second week of September is when it is. And they got all the way close to Paris. In fact, the Germans were, I think, I want to say within at least 40, 50 miles from Paris at one point. Looked like they were going to drive on Paris. And what happened was the French counterattacked with pretty much most of their forces, even using the reserves. And the French were led by this French general at the beginning of the war named Joseph Joffre. And so they included majority French forces with some British under, I think, General John French. And what's interesting about the First Battle of the Marne was that it was considered one of the largest battles in history. It involved like 2 million troops combined on both sides, British, French versus the Germans. And you have to go all the way back to the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations in 1813, October 1813. I think that was the largest European battle before, which was like 600,000 troops. Just to give you an idea of how big this battle was, the amount of casualties in the First Battle of the Marne was equal to Leipzig, the amount of troops involved. That's crazy about that. But what happened was the German drive on Paris, it actually stalled. They weren't able to take Paris. And so what happened was the Germans were forced to back up at that point. I think to where I don't know if you can see it right there, but up to like where the Aisne River is, which is, I think, right here, like north of the Marne River. And at that point, you start seeing this deal where the Western Front starts forming at that point. And then one thing that's very famous at the beginning of the war, you may have heard about, after the German offensive collapsed, they had this thing called the Race to the Sea, where both sides started constructing trenches on both sides from, like, I think the North Sea in Belgium all the way down to Germany, where almost close where Switzerland is, right there. And so what ends up happening is that World War I starts to be this defensive war. You get trench warfare, afterwards. And so you end up with basically a very bloody conflict. And I think the amount of casualties that really end up being caused, at least on the Western Front, is like close to about 13 million actual casualties actually occur on the Western Front. So Western Front, which lasts from 1914 to 1918 in World War I, was the bloodiest front really in World War I overall. And especially because of all the new kinds of technology and warfare. I think artillery, and disease, I think, were the two main things that killed the most people, they say, in World War I. More than, say, a bullet, that kind of thing. But that's one thing that, World War I is very famous for is all the so-called trench warfare, of course, that they would have during the war. Now, here's kind of a map showing you, by the way, the different fronts they had in World War I. So they were fighting all over the place. So, yeah, the Western Front is mostly, being fought predominantly in France and Belgium, like in this area right here. They do have other fronts you can see that are also fought in World War I that I did want to mention about as well. They had the Eastern Front. Now, that one was actually successful for the actual Central Powers. They actually would defeat Russia and also Romanian war. And at one point, the Germans and the Central Powers actually pushed the Russians back like into the Ukraine. They took like most of Poland, and so that's going to be very instrumental later because, as you know, Russian defeats in the war will later cause the Russian Revolution in 1917, where the Russian Empire will collapse. Nicholas II will be forced to abdicate the throne, and that, of course, will end the Romanov dynasty. Of course, Nicholas is later, his whole family's killed, by the Bolsheviks, because later they'll form the Soviet Union, of course, afterwards. So that's definitely one event that's kind of famous, of course, with that. In Italy, you see in northern Italy, they had also the Italian front, which some people call the Alpine front as well. Italy fought against Austria-Hungary, like in the Alps. It was very mountainous fighting, which was also pretty bloody as well. I fought mostly in northeastern Italy, but also in the Adriatic, you can see as well, northern Adriatic Sea right there. And both sides suffered over 4 million casualties. I think Benito Mussolini, I know on one side, fought with the Italians later. He'd be a famous dictator after the war. Battle of Caporetto in 1917 and the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, those are kind of considered the most famous battles that are fought in the Italian campaign, all that. And I think that last one is kind of considered a major Italian victory, of course, in the war, because the Italians eventually won the war in the end. The Balkans campaign, which you see on the bottom there around Serbia. Austria-Hungary, of course, invaded Serbia in the war. However, it didn't go well for them. It was later rebuffed by help from the Allies. And that's another conflict that Austria-Hungary lost as well. Austria-Hungary didn't fare well in the war, except against the Russians. Down there, it's kind of hard to see it, but they also have the so-called Middle Eastern theater as well. There was a front down there where Britain fought with its allies, like the French were involved. Australia and New Zealander corps, like the Anzacs, were involved, I think, in that conflict a little bit. And also a lot of the Arabs joined up with the British to fight the Turks because they wanted independence in the Middle East from them. And a lot of the conflicts were fought all over the place. They fought Palestine, Jordan, Syria. They fought in Iraq and Iran and parts of Turkey. So it's fought pretty much all throughout that area. You may have heard about how the conflict was later famous for Lawrence of Arabia. The T. Lawrence, who was a famous British officer that helped out the Arabs in the war. And he was kind of famous because they made movies about him, like I think Peter O'Toole played him, I think, in the famous movie Lawrence of Arabia and all that. But he was kind of instrumental in helping the Arabs to learn how to fight against the Turks, because the Arabs weren't very good at fighting warfare at that time, at least modernized warfare overall. They did have an African front, believe it or not, on Africa, because of imperialism and all that. That led to, the Germans fighting against other European powers. Mostly fought East-West Africa and part of South Africa. And, of course, both sides, hired a lot of African soldiers to fight pretty much on the German and the Allied side in the war. And don't forget about the Atlantic. In the Atlantic, they were also fighting, too. The German submarines, U-boats, preyed on a lot of Allied shipping, try to strangle the Allies' supply during the war. And also, it does lead to the so-called Lusitania sinking, which happened in May of 1915, which I'll get to later. That is a major event, that does propel the United States into supporting the Allies. And I think it's a major cause of why the United States, of course, got involved in World War I, because the Germans unrestricted submarine warfare. Let me also talk about World War I soldiers. Now, there are a lot of different soldiers that fought in World War I. A lot of them had nicknames that they often called each other, of course, during the war. Of course, the most notorious, if you know about it, were the Germans. They were called all kinds of names like Hun, because they kind of compared the Germans to Attila the Hun invading France, a long time ago. Fritz was a common name because a lot of soldiers were named Frederick, so the term Fritz was just a nickname for that. Kraut or La Boche, just kind of similar, were nicknames because the fact that the Germans would eat, sauerkraut, with sausage, and so since the name being used. I think La Boche meant cabbage head or something like that, the cabbage. because of that. The French were called pelous, which I think meant hairy ones because they wouldn't shave. They have like beards or mustaches, that kind of thing. I think the guy in the middle, I think, is a Frenchman, pelous. But they also, I think the British were called frog, because I think some of the French were known for eating like frogs and snails and things like that. The British were called Tommy, because I think a soldier, one of the first to enlist in World War I, was named Tommy Atkins, so the name stuck. American soldiers were called Yanks, like Yankee, or Doughboys as well. And then the Italians were sometimes called macaroni because they ate pasta and things like that as well. Australians and New Zealanders, called Aussies and Kiwi. You may hear that terms being used before. But during the war, this was like one of the first major wars that the Australian New Zealanders fought in, as part of the British Empire at the time. And so they were part of this thing called the Anzacs, which were like an Australian New Zealander army corps that were under the British. And the Anzacs were very famous for fighting in the Gallipoli campaign, which I'll talk about today. That's one thing that's kind of famous I'll kind of get into. Before I get into that, though, let me discuss also the fact that World War I, introduced all these different kinds of weapons that you're looking at. So that's part of why, like I said, World War I was such a killer. They had new machine guns that could fire like 500-600 bullets a minute, which is crazy. So that says 300. But I had some at the 500-600 range, I think by the war they had. Different kinds of chemical weapons. I think mustard gas and chlorine gas were some of the worst they used in the war. Of course, the Germans had U-boats, which submarines went back to the 19th century. But World War I was one of the first wars where submarines were used, of course, a lot. The Germans had Zeppelins. You know what those are, Zeppelins. They used those to actually drop bombs, even on England, during the war. Of course, flamethrowers you're seeing there. The airplane, of course, was used during the war. The tank was also something they started using in 1916 as well, which the British introduced at the Battle of Somme. So all kinds of new kinds of weapon were used, along with trench warfare, etc. That all made it real bloody. But things like the tank will be kind of important later to kind of make war more mobile, in the future. I did want to talk about for a few minutes about the Gallipoli campaign that happened, which was kind of a British idea in the war. The Gallipoli campaign was a campaign where they were trying to fight the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the Central Powers at the end of 1914. They had this idea that they could knock the Turks out of the war if they could take the Gallipoli Peninsula and then march up and seize control of their capital of Istanbul, which I think the British still called it Constantinople at the time. And the problem was that Russia was being blockaded. They couldn't get supplies through the Black Sea to help them in the war. And so that was the whole main reason of why they wanted to do it. And I think I've got a map showing you the idea, which was to bring up forces through the Aegean Sea, take the peninsula, march up here, take the capital, and then from there they could take control of the Black Sea and then march up here, using ships or whatever to supply the Russians. So that's like the main goal of it, was really to knock the Turks out of the war and resupply Russia. However, they talk about the whole thing being the brainchild of Winston Churchill. He was one of the men that kind of came up with the idea of Britain. He was a politician at the time. He wasn't prime minister, and so it involved like different powers that were in this particular campaign. It's also called the Dardanelles campaign. And most of the forces were led by Ian Hamilton. He was a British general. The bulk of the forces were British. About 350,000 were involved. The French put up about 80,000 troops. The Anzacs had about 65,000 they put up as well. However, what happened, if you know at Gallipoli, they were able to start landing forces you see in those areas that are kind of in that kind of light purplish areas. But what happened was they weren't able to really penetrate the peninsula. And so in, like, I think April of 1915, the battles of Anzac Bay and also Gallipoli were fought, which were really the bloodiest, I think, conflict that was associated with the Gallipoli campaign. And the Allies suffered heavy casualties, they not being able to penetrate it. And so if you look at here, the actual, on the Allied side, they suffered like close to like 250,000 were actually killed or wounded or captured in the actual conflict. And the Anzacs themselves suffered like something like 35,000, like half their force was either killed or wounded in the conflict. So it's a very bloody conflict for the British. It was really pretty much a failure. Here's kind of a picture of the casualties on both sides. You can see how the British suffered the most with 120,000 right here. Look at the Anzacs. They're like, with New Zealand, 35-something thousand right here. It's a good chunk of the actual force, So I think in Australia, New Zealand, they have what they call Anzac Day. You may have heard of today, which is kind of still celebrated because of that and all that. But it does kind of force the Allies to abandon Gallipoli by early 1916. They withdraw their forces. And part of why the Turks were successful was the fact that the Germans had aided them. They had given them military aid. They also had sent advisors to help out the Turkish forces. In fact, there was one general named Otto von Sanders who had been involved in it. That's very well known in the Gallipoli campaign. And then the Turks had a pretty good general, too, named Mustafa Kemal. He was the best general on their side in the war. And he became kind of a hero after the war. They later called him Ataturk, which meant father of Turkey, because after the war, the Turks, their empire broke up, if you know about this. And so the Turks formed Turkey, the area of Turkey, into a republic in 1923. He later went on to be the first leader of it after the war. So that's kind of Gallipoli, which was like a total failure, for basically the British with their allies. Now, then you have, of course, the other thing that happened too in World War I was World War I in 1960 had a lot of bloody battles. Verdun being one of the most famous that was fought between February and December of 1916. And they had another bloody battle that was also called the Somme. World War I was very famous for a lot of stalemate battles where neither side kind of won, or they were kind of, if there was a victory, it was kind of almost indecisive on both sides who kind of won. And Verdun was considered to be the greatest and also the longest battle in World War I. It lasted, you can see, almost 9-10 months. Like 10 months or something like that is how long it was right there. February 21st to December 16th, 1921. So that's a very long time they fought this particular battle. And it's kind of a map of the battlefield right here. Verdun was actually a German offensive battle where the Germans attempted to attack the northeastern part of France around where the Meuse River is, which was kind of a heavily fortified area due to a bunch of fortresses that the French had built there, I think as far back as the 1890s. You see a bunch of those forts right there, like Fort Douaumont right there, Fort Vaux, Fort Souville. Those are all basically right here, very close to the, it's like very close to the, I guess would be the French-Belgium frontier right here. So that was the target area that the Germans were trying to attack, and they were hoping to break through there. They concentrate all their forces at one spot, break through, then take Paris, and that would be basically the end of the war. And at the Battle of Verdun, there were these two opposing forces of generals that were there. You had Falkenhayn on one side. He was there. He was the German chief of staff who fought mostly in the Western Front first. And then on the other side, you had Henry Pétain, or Henry Philippe Pétain. They call it Philippe Pétain in France, actually. He was considered one of the greatest generals in the war on the French side. He's also called the so-called Lion of Verdun. And so that battle ended up being very pivotal, of course, in the war. And Falkenhayn wanted to use a war of attrition. He said that if we could kill for every, we killed two Frenchmen for every one German that died in this battle, we could win, basically. So he talked about the idea of that they could bleed the French white, at Verdun and all that. But Petain's forces were able to hold out for 9 months or so, 9-10 months that they held out against the Germans. And during the actual battle, there was a motto that kind of became popular among the forces of the French, which was "They shall not pass." And so the casualties, I think the casualty rate for Verdun was I want to say 600,000-700,000 in that battle. But I think in the vicinity, they say it may have been as high as 1 million, possibly more, how bloody it was. That wasn't it. They also had another battle, of course, break out at the same time. Of course, there's a little picture of Verdun there, but they had also the so-called Battle of the Somme that was fought north of Verdun as well. That one was more of a British idea of a counteroffensive, which the French also joined as well, which lasted over a period of 5 months, July, November of 1916, right there. And the Somme battle was considered, by the way, to be one of Britain's bloodiest battles that they fought in World War I. The Somme, they say, was one of the largest battles ever fought, at least up to this time in World War I. They think over 3 million troops were actually involved in the Battle of Somme on both sides combined. That's crazy. And they think the casualties were close to 1 million, also as well, of Battle of Somme. And because of the British bringing in tanks, they think they were able to kind of push the Germans back, but only maybe about 6 miles is about it. They were able to push the Germans back. And so, yeah, it was a victory for the Allies, but it was almost considered like a kind of an indecisive type victory because pretty much they were at a stalemate afterwards. So, but the Germans felt like, they had been kind of defeated. They weren't able to really, basically, break through and, take Paris at that point. And so one of the things that happened, after this is that it does create a lot of discontent in a lot of the, countries that are involved in the war. I know in Britain and France, they replaced a lot of their prime ministers, like David Lloyd George became the prime minister. Of course, you can see there in Britain. The French, Georges Clemenceau, he became the ruler, of course. He became the ruler of president of France, I think, after that, because of that. And then the Germans decided that they had to do some things too as well. They were kind of worried that the United States was going to come into the war. And so they started practicing unrestricted submarine warfare to try to block supplies to the Allies, of course, in Europe. And then there was another thing that happened too that's very famous, about at that time, 1916 to 1917. The Germans would draw to this defensive line called the Hindenburg Line. They kind of back up a little bit. And so they're kind of concerned that if they don't do that, basically, they might lose the war. So that's at that point, that's kind of how the war's going on. It's not really going anywhere, at that time. And, in 1916, it's kind of at a stalemate. And we'll get to it, into later in the week. There's going to be some things that's going to happen that kind of change the war. Russia is going to drop out of World War I because of the so-called Russian Revolution, where the Tsar is overthrown, the Romanov dynasty. So you have that happen. Also, the United States enters the war too, April of 1917. So 1917 is kind of a pivotal year in World War I, into really, of course, changing it. I want to say, looks like a few joins at the end. Elijah, hey, what's going on? Of course, Courtney also had joined us. I got to say, hey, y'all, but hope you're having a good morning out there as well. So later in the week, like I said, I'll kind of continue talking about when I'll get into more later into the war, what happens. I'll also kind of talk about the rise of the Soviet Union, I will, of course, talk about the end of the war. Of course, the big thing, Treaty of Versailles. We'll talk about that, and of course, the results of that lead into what happens after the war, and of course, what leads to World War II later. So that's it for today. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions, pretty much out there. But if you do have any comments later, please let me know. Of course, on my channel, you can leave me, of course, any kind of comments you want or questions. Of course, reminder too, you have different assignments out. Of course, as you know, I already told you about those. But of course, the most important one is the second exam. Of course, you need to, of course, work on overall. So that's it for pretty much right now. So I'll see y'all later in the week. But y'all take care. I hope y'all had a great Halloween, by the way. So y'all take care.